Will Hay was born in Stockton-on-Tees in 1888. His father was an engineer, and the family moved around quite a lot in his early years, but they finally resided in Manchester. When he left school, he got himself a job as an engineer, and then he managed to get a job. He was employed as an interpreter for the Gallico Printers Association. He was quite fluent in languages throughout his life. He could speak German, Italian, French, Afrikaans, Norwegian, and there was even a smattering of Chinese as well. But while he was working as an interpreter in the evening, he started to perform. He performed at sort of charity hospital events, also late night concerts, monologues, singing, and he also juggled. The reason why he juggled, because one of his heroes was W.C. Fields, and he saw W.C. Fields a couple of times in the Manchester area around about 1908, 1909. He wanted to develop, though, his act, so it came to him via one of his sisters, one of his elder sisters called Eppie. She was a school teacher, and she would come home and regale to the Hay family of all the exploits that the children had got up to that day, and Will Hay would laugh. So he thought, yes, that's what I'll do, that's my character. Originally he was going to drag up and play it as a schoolmistress, but then he decided, no, I'll play it as a schoolmaster. So he wrote a song called Bend Down, and in between each verse there would be sort of jokes and patter. And then finally his professional debut was at the Empire Hull in 1909, and then he toured Bend Down around the music halls of the United Kingdom. First World War came around. He was desperate to do his bit for his country. Unfortunately, he couldn't due to medical reasons. He had hemorrhoids, as he was quoted at the time as saying it was a real kick up the backside. So during the First World War, he decided to develop Bend Down and added another character, a young scholar, which was played by a boy called Tommy Pryor. That was then a 15-minute sketch known as The Schoolmaster and the Scholar. Towards the end of the war, he joined the very famous Fred Karno troupe, a couple of revue shows, Nosey Nose and Moonstruck. After he finished with Fred Karno, he went back to the Schoolmaster act and he developed it again, adding another character, an old man called Harbottle, and this became the cornerstone of his career, the fourth form at St Michael's. And they toured up and down the United Kingdom throughout the 1920s. They even toured abroad. He was a success in America, New Zealand, Australia, South Africa. Originally, the young boy and the old man were played by cousins of his, Bert and Cyril Platt. And then the young boy was replaced by Will Hay's own son, imaginatively named Will Hay Jr. And the older man was played by H. Gordon Saunders. During this period, 1922, he was the first British comedian to broadcast live on the BBC. 1925 was the first of his 4 Royal Command performances. And then into the early 30s, there was a big cinema boom in this country. Lots of Hollywood films over here. But of course we want in this country to find our own stars. So the British film industry went to musical stars, such as Rob Wilton, Sandy Powell, Max Miller, and the big 3 were Will Hay, George Formby, and Gracie Fields. Will Hay originally was at British International Pictures. His first film was 1934, Those Were the Days, based on a Panero farce. Then he made Radio Parade of 1935, and his third film was Dandy Dick, another Panero farce. Will Hay ended up at Gainsborough Pictures because now a big star, and Gainsborough were looking for a big star themselves, and in charge of production was Michael Borken, and Will Hay was happy to join Gainsborough. He signed a contract that would last until the end of 1939. His first picture at Gainsborough was Boys Will Be Boys in 1935, and this was the first time the schoolmaster character appeared on the screen. Also, while he was at Gainsborough, the team came together for the films that he would be remembered for. Initially, he was directed by an American director called William Bodine, who directed people such as Mary Pickford during the silent era. But Good Morning Boys, which he made in 1937, he now had a French director called Marcel Varnel, and Marcel Varnel understood Will Hay's comedy. Also with Good Morning Boys, the writers had now been sort of pared down to just two of them really. Will Hay himself originally had written screenplays in conjunction with other writers for his early Gainsborough films, but with Good Morning Boys it now really came down to just George Marriott Edgar and Val Guest. And there was a script conference for Good Morning Boys, and Val Guest remembered that Will Hay went into this script conference and about halfway through it just got up and said, "I don't need to be here. You understand my comedy. I'll just let you get on with it." So that's what happened there. But also, the other thing that was added to the Gainsborough films was the young boy and the old man from the Four Former St Michael's. So now you had a young boy being played by Graham Moffat, and the old man Harbottle was played by Maughan Marriott. And this teaming of these three comic actors just became a huge success in British cinema. The film after Good Morning Boys, of course, was Oh Mr Porter, which is considered to be Will Hay's greatest film. And this film, once again, he plays a bumbling figure of authority that is now somehow ended up as a station master in Northern Ireland, having to deal with gun runners. And this film was such a success in this country, it took over £500,000 at the British box office. The British cinema-going public loved Hay, Marriott and Moffat, and they continued in that vein to around about 1939. But Will Hay was now becoming slightly disillusioned with it all and finding it a little bit tiresome, and he wanted to move on. He didn't want to become known as a three-legged act. And his last two films he made at Gainsborough were Ask a Policeman and Where's That Fire? He made them back to back. Ask a Policeman, in my opinion, is also up there with Oh Mr Porter as Will Hay's greatest film. And reporters came on the set of Where's That Fire, and there is a quote from an article where Will Hay was basically saying to the reporters, "So which hat am I meant to be wearing today? Is it the fireman's hat, the policeman's hat, the captain's hat?" There was a formula now to his films, and he just had had enough of it and decided that he would not renew his contract with Gainsborough and find other avenues of interest. But when Will Hay left Gainsborough Pictures, his career was at a crossroads and he didn't know exactly what he was going to do. But then there was the outbreak of the Second World War, so he threw himself into doing his bit for his country. Initially he became chairman of the variety section of ENSA, and he took a touring party to entertain the troops in France. He also became the section commander of his local defence volunteers in Hendon, where he lived. He went on marches, he also went to rallies, he spoke at rallies doing his bit for the country. And of course cinema was used for propaganda reasons, of course, to help morale of people still over here, and also the troops fighting as well. And Michael Borken came calling from Ealing Studios, and Hay and Borken had a great working relationship, and Borken said, "George Formby's coming to Ealing. I also want the other major film star to come and make films here." So Hay went to Ealing Studios, and his first film was The Ghost of St Michael's. To ease Will Hay back into filming, Borken arranged for Marcel Varnell, who directed Hay's Gainsborough films, to be in charge of direction for The Ghost of St Michael's. Will Hay at Ealing also made a short film for the Ministry of Information, which was Go to Blazes. Now the Ministry of Information made a series of these 10-minute propaganda films. Go to Blazes, interesting fact that the director of it, Walter Ford, had no recollection when he was asked many years later of ever directing this short film. Now in Go to Blazes though, Will Hay is meant to show us, the public, how to deal with incendiary bombs, but of course Will Hay being Will Hay, he doesn't know exactly how to deal with an incendiary bomb, and instead his wife, played by Muriel George in the film, and his daughter, played by a young Thora Hird, they're the ones who deal with the incendiary bombs. Thora Hird had previously worked with Will Hay for his second feature film at Ealing, which was The Black Sheep of Whitehall. Thora Hird was discovered by George Formby. He saw her in a play where she was playing a 60-year-old woman, and he wanted to make a film version of the play. It ended up becoming the George Formby film Turned Out Nice Again. When she went for a screen test for the film, they realised that you could clearly see that this was a young woman with lots of makeup on, playing an old woman, so she couldn't have the part. But Michael Borken thought Thora Hird was a marvellous actress, so signed her up for Ealing. They were still trying to find her a part. At the same time, Will Hay was trying to find somebody to play secretary in The Black Sheep of Whitehall. He watched lots of screen tests, and then Michael Borken said to him, "Could you please watch the screen test of Thora Hird?" Will Hay ran it and said, "Wow, what a face." And from there, Thora Hird's career took off. After making Go to Blazes, Will Hay's next feature film was The Goose Steps Out, but that also started as a short for the Ministry of Information. It was an idea by Bernard Miles and Reg Groves, but the Ministry of Information looked at it and thought this could actually be turned into a feature film instead. So went back to Michael Borken. Borken then handed it over to the writers of the Will Hay films at Ealing, which were Angus MacPhail and John Dighton. MacPhail would go on to write Captive Heart and also Whiskey Galore, and John Dighton, Kind Hearts and Coronets and The Man in the White Suit. So now they had an idea and they had to turn it into a Will Hay film. One of the things that they did was take a sketch that they had written for another Ealing film called Next of Kin, directed by Thorold Dickinson. And it was a sketch where there are some English place names being explained to some German students, and it was decided to be dropped from that particular film. So they took it again and they developed it into The Goose Steps Out. That's the scene where Will Hay is instructing to these German espionage students place names in England, such as Bicester, Gloucester, Worcester, and of course Slough. So the film was made as a morale booster. I mean, the strap tagline to the film is "Will pokes fun at the Hun." So the writers of the Will Hay Ealing comedies were Angus MacPhail and John Dighton, but Will Hay did actually contribute to the script of The Goose Steps Out. Dighton and MacPhail were never on set. They were busy with other projects at Ealing, and Will Hay would rewrite some of the dialogue, and his sounding board was Charles Hawtrey, who plays one of the German espionage students in the film. Hawtrey's dressing room was next door to Will Hay, and Will Hay would just bang on the dressing room wall. Hawtrey would come into Will Hay's dressing room, they would sit down, have a pot of tea, and then Will Hay would read the changes to Charles Hawtrey. If Hawtrey laughed, it stayed in. If Hawtrey didn't laugh, it was out. The Goose Steps Out is the second directorial collaboration between Basil Dearden and Will Hay. The first one, of course, was Black Sheep of Whitehall. And the question people have asked over the years is, well, how much did Basil Dearden direct and how much did Will Hay direct? People who worked on the film, Sidney Cole, one of the editors at Ealing, he said that Dearden directed and Will Hay was just allowed to watch the rushes. Michael Borken said that directorial duties were Basil Dearden's, but special concessions were allowed to Will Hay for the comedy routines. And Barry Morse, who making his screen debut in this film, another one of the German espionage students who was in the thick of the action, he said that Dearden was in charge of the more technical side of things, lenses, lighting, cameras, whereas Will Hay was in charge of the comedy performances. And this had a few problems, because what would happen is Will Hay, behind Dearden's back, would talk to the actors about the scene that they were going to shoot. Dearden had already mapped out how the scene was going to look. So this came to a head when Dearden would call the actors to the set, and he would look up and notice they were not standing in the positions that he thought that they should be standing in, and Will Hay would just turn around to him and say, "Oh, I've decided we should do it completely differently." And this is how filming continued throughout The Goose Steps Out, because initially with Black Sheep of Whitehall, Will Hay was quoted as saying, when he was asked, "Oh, how much are you going to be directing in this film?" he said, "I'm just there as moral support," because they were nurturing Basil Dearden at Ealing to become a film director. Dearden, of course, would go on to direct other Ealing films such as Sarabande, For Dead Lovers, The Blue Lamp and Pool of London. The biggest altercation on The Goose Steps Out actually occurred between Charles Hawtrey, Basil Dearden and Will Hay. Towards the end of the film, most of the film is shot with them inside an aeroplane making their way back to the United Kingdom. So the aeroplane was suspended over the soundstage at Ealing, and Charles Hawtrey said, "Is there going to be a safety net?" And Basil did and said, "We don't need a safety net." And Charles Hawtrey said, "Well, I'm not filming anything until you produce an accident insurance policy." And there was this sort of standoff between everybody. And while this was going on, of course, the crew are setting up the aeroplane, and the actor Richard George, who plays the pilot, fell out of the aeroplane, landed on the studio floor, hurt his back. As a precaution, he was taken to hospital. Everything was fine. And then Will Hay finally piped up and said to Charles Hawtrey and Basil Dearden, "Yes, I think Charles was right." And then to placate Charles Hawtrey, to calm him down, he said, "Come into the dressing room." And then Will Hay ordered a pot of tea. And that was the way Will Hay would diffuse situations. He would always order a pot of tea. Peter Ustinov, who's also in the film, he remembers Will Hay not being very funny while they were making the film, but when he saw Will Hay up on the screen, he saw that he was a very funny man. But he just remembers Will Hay spending most of his time very introspective, huddled around a grey blanket. But as soon as Will Hay wanted a pot of tea, everything would stop on the set. Everyone would have to stop working, and Will Hay would sit there, drink his tea, and once he was ready, they would start filming again. Probably the main reason why Will Hay was wrapped in a blanket, because it was filmed over the December-January period of 1941, which was a pretty cold period in the United Kingdom at that time. A Will Hay film generally took 8 weeks to shoot, but because they filmed over the Christmas and New Year, it took 11 weeks in total. Barry Morse told me that one of the strangest things, of course, shooting the Goose Steps Out, there they are meant to be in Germany, and the whole time they're filming, so all of a sudden they had to stop filming due to air raid warnings, and it kind of reminded you, there we are making a comedy film, but there is actually a war taking place outside this film studio. So when the film was released, it came with a press book, and one of the ideas to generate publicity at local cinemas for your next coming attraction. So the cinema manager had to go and purchase a goose. A pen would be made. You would place the goose inside. Next to that would be a step ladder, and then there would be a door with a sign saying "Not in." And there you have it. Hey presto, the Goose Steps Out. Will Hay's next film at Ealing was My Learned Friend. Before filming began, though, Will Hay went to see his Harley Street doctor, and his doctor told him that he had cancer and a minor operation would be needed. So the idea was that Will Hay would shoot My Learned Friend, and at the end of it he would have the operation. Filming started on My Learned Friend, and Will Hay worked his way through it, but the pain became slightly more insistent throughout. He ended up with a slightly nervous tic. He only had one more scene to shoot, but they decided it would be best if he went to have the operation. So he had the minor operation. A couple of weeks later he was back to shoot the one and only scene, which was the coroner's scene. You can clearly see that Will Hay has had an operation. His weight has sort of dropped off from his face and his neck. A lot of weight has dropped off him. Completed My Learned Friend, and then the idea was that Will Hay's next film, it was advertised by Ealing in the trade papers, a film called Bob's Your Uncle, written by Austin Melford, but the pain came back again, and his doctor said, "You're going to need major surgery." The surgery was so major that Michael Borkin said that Ealing actually had prepared an obituary for Will Hay. The operation was a success. Will Hay recuperated. He started writing his autobiography, I Enjoyed Every Minute, but he never finished it. But his doctor said to him, "You can't make films anymore. It's too strenuous for you. You're going to have to find another medium." So he went back to radio. On radio on the BBC, he was a quizmaster on Merry Go Round. He was even on the illustrious panel of the Brains Trust programme. And in 1944 he had his own radio programme called the Will Hay Radio Programme, otherwise known as The Diary of a Schoolmaster. It was split into 2 halves. The first half would be Will Hay playing a character called Dr. Muffin, at his digs, and he would generally be having problems with his landlady and her son. And the second half would be given to the fourth form of St Michael's, and that ran for 2.5 series from 1944 to 1945. They also took the fourth form of St Michael's sketch onto the stage, running at the Victoria Palace in salute to variety, and then again in 1946 a production called For Crying Out Loud, which was written by Val Guest, Will Hay's former writer at Gainsborough. When that concluded in 1946 though, Will Hay had a stroke and was unable to work, and he spent the last few years of his life just recuperating, spent a lot of time in Norway, and also his doctor told him to go visit hot climates, so he spent some time in South Africa. And Will Hay sadly passed away after another stroke in April of 1949. In my opinion, Will Hay's comedy today is still fresh. It's generally because of the wordplay, the dialogue. Will Hay saw comedy as a science. He would go through a script, he knew where to put the punctuation, he knew which word to emphasise and which words were funny so that he could build the laughter.